Morning, boys and girls. I'm glad that you could be here today to join me on story time. You come from the Ashbury Preschool, is that right? Well, at home, I have two daughters. They're older than you are, but when they were your age, they went to Ashbury Preschool just like you are. So I was really glad that you could come and join us. We're going to look at 3 books today. The first one is called David's Pockets. Let's see what happens to David and his pockets. David had a new pair of pants with pockets so wide and deep they almost reached to his knees. David wondered what he could find to put in his pockets. Puff fit into them, but he always climbed right out. Puff is a kitten, see? And cookies just turned to crumbs. One day, David's grandfather said, "Why don't you look for secret treasure to fill your pockets?" David did not know where any secret treasure was, but he decided to look for it anyway. David and Sandy looked and looked. There was no secret treasure in the house. There was none in the garage. And who's Sandy? Sandy is the little dog. See the dog? But David found something on the ground. What did he find on the ground? A pebble. He saw something floating in the air, and he discovered something in a clover patch. David put them in his pockets. He saw floating in the air a feather from the birds on the trees, and he saw 4-leaf clover in the clover patch, and he put those in his pocket. David and Sandy went into the woods. They looked for treasure by a little stream, and they heard something. They heard the frog, and they heard the dragonfly. Something ran across a rock. David and Sandy saw something hanging from the branch of a tree. Look what they saw hanging from the tree.
Spider web.
A spider web, right. They saw things growing by the path. David carefully placed one in the top of a pocket. See what they saw by the path? They saw flowers. And he picked one up and put it in his pocket. They heard things saying chirp, chirp. What do you suppose that was? And they heard a buzzing sound.
Bee.
Bees, right. I don't think they put either of those in his pockets. They found things under an old log, but they did not disturb them. Finally, David and Sandy sat down under a tree. David wondered if he would ever find a treasure. Something fell at their feet, and David put it in one of his pockets. See what fell at their feet? A leaf. He picked up other things on the ground, and soon his pockets were filled. David found so many things, he forgot about hunting for secret treasure. David and Sandy ran all the way home, stopping only once to watch something that fluttered by. What fluttered by? A butterfly, right. "Grandfather," David called excitedly, "look at the things I found. Let me tell you about all the things I saw." "You found the secret treasure, didn't you, David?" Grandfather asked. David stopped smiling. "No, I didn't, Grandfather," he said. "I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find it." "But David," Grandfather said, chuckling, "your pockets are full." Suddenly, David knew what Grandfather meant. He proudly emptied his pockets. David and his grandfather made a list of the many things, many treasures that David had found. And look at the list. We have rocks, a crow feather, acorns over here, a frog. Do you suppose he put that in his pocket? Ants, I don't know about those in my pocket. But these are all the things that they found while they were on their walk. Wait, grandfather, David said. We forgot something. And he added the names of Puff and Sandy to his list. And that's the end of the story. So, yes, he did. And David and Sandy went looking for treasure. And when they found it, they didn't know it was treasure. But when they got it back, they realized that it was. And that's the story of David's pockets. The next story we have is called The Biggest House in the World. Let's see about the biggest house in the world. Some snails lived on a juicy cabbage. They moved gently around, carrying their houses from leaf to leaf in search of a tender spot to nibble on. See the snails on the cabbage? A snail has his house with him, doesn't he? When he moves around, his shell or his house goes wherever he does. One day, a little snail said to his father, "When I grow up, I want to have the biggest house in the world." "That is silly," said his father, who happened to be the wisest snail on the cabbage. "Some things are better small." And he told this story. Once upon a time, a little snail, just like you, said to his father, "When I grow up, I want to have the biggest house in the world." "Some things are better small," said his father. "Keep your house light and easy to carry." But the little snail would not listen, and hidden in the shade of a large cabbage leaf, he twisted and twitched this way and that, until he discovered how to make his house grow. It grew and grew, and the snails on the cabbage said, "You surely have the biggest house in the world." See how big the snail's house has gotten? See, the others still have small houses, but this snail, who didn't listen, he has a big one. The little snail kept on twisting and twitching until his house was as big as a melon. Then, by moving his tail swiftly from left to right, he learned to grow large pointed bulges. See how the snail shell looks now? See the bulges on it? It's really gotten big, hasn't it? And by squeezing and pushing and by wishing very hard, he was able to add bright colors and beautiful designs. Now he knew that his was the biggest and the most beautiful house in the whole world, and he was proud and happy. Look at how the house looks now. See all the colors? A swarm of butterflies flew overhead. "Look," one of them said, "a cathedral." "No," said another, "it's a circus." They never guessed that what they were looking at was the house of a snail. And a family of frogs on their way to a distant pond stopped in awe. "Never," they later told some cousins, "never have you seen such an amazing sight, an ordinary little snail with a house like a birthday cake." The frogs thought that it looked like a birthday cake because it was all brightly colored. One day, after they had eaten all the leaves and only a few knobby stems were left, the snails moved to another cabbage. But the little snail, alas, couldn't move. His house was much too heavy. See, all the other snails are moving over here to another cabbage because they've eaten this one. And the big snail, his house is too heavy and he can't move. He was left behind with nothing to eat, and he slowly faded away. Nothing remained but the house, and that too, little by little, crumbled until nothing remained at all. See what happened to the house? The snail couldn't move his house to where there was food. Then his house crumbled.
And then it broke.
And that was the end of the story. The little snail was almost in tears. But then he remembered his own house. I shall keep it small, he thought, and when I grow up, I shall go wherever I please. And so one day, light and joyous, he went on to see the world. Some leaves fluttered lightly in the breeze, and others hung heavily to the ground. Where the dark earth had split, crystals glittered in the early sun. There were polka-dotted mushrooms and towery stems from which little flowers seemed to wave. There was a pine cone lying in the lacy shade of ferns, and pebbles in a nest of sand, smooth and round, like the eggs of a turtle dove. Lichen clung to the rocks and bark to the trees. The tender buds were sweet and cool with the morning dew, and the little snail was very happy. And here's the little snail on his way to see all those things, because he listened to his father's story, and he kept his house light and small, so that when it came time to move, he could move his house with him, like all the other snails. And that's the story of the biggest house in the world. Well, I thought we'd read another one. How about if we read another one about a mouse that I have right over here, okay? This one is called Another Mouse to Feed. And this is a story about a family of mice. Mr. and Mrs. Mouse had many children. So many, in fact, that they often forgot their names, as well as how many they had. Look at Mr. and Mrs. Mouse and all the children. A lot of mice. To help make ends meet, Mrs. Mouse got a job as a roller skating instructor. It was a lot of work, but she never complained because she loved little mice, especially her own. And here's Mrs. Mouse as a roller skating instructor, and all the mice who are learning to roller skate. And they all have helmets on in case they fall. It was a lot of work for Mr. Mouse, too. In fact, he had to have 3 jobs to earn enough money to take care of his family. But he didn't mind, because he too loved little mice, especially his own. And here's Mr. Mouse at his 3 jobs. Looks like he's working on a construction site here, and he's a chef here at this job, and he's keeping the books in a business in this job. But while he's doing it, he's thinking about all of his children at home. I have my hands full with all these mice, said Mrs. Mouse. I think our family is big enough. I don't think I could manage 4 jobs, said Mr. Mouse. I think our family is big enough, too. They were just having a cup of tea when there was a knock at the door. Who could it be at this time of night? Asked Mrs. Mouse. There's one way to find out, said Mr. Mouse, and he opened the door. And on the doorstep was a wicker basket containing a tiny mouse wrapped in a blanket. A note was pinned to the blanket reading, "Take care of my child." Here they are at the front door. There's the door, and here's the basket with a little mouse in it. A mouse in need, said Mrs. Mouse. Is another mouse to feed, said Mr. Mouse. All the mouse children were delighted. It was nice to meet a mouse who wasn't a brother or a sister. Mrs. Mouse went to the employment agency to get a second job. At home, Mr. Mouse started scrubbing clean clothes and stirring empty pots. They were both cracking up. Edgar, the oldest child, noticed it first, and he told the others, "If 2 parents can support 31 children, then 32 children can support 2 parents," Edgar declared. "Dad, you take a much-needed vacation from your jobs. Mom, you forget about teaching roller skating for now. Your children are going to take over." "But what about your education?" asked Mrs. Mouse. "We'll work after school, weekends, and holidays," said Edgar. So all the Mouse children who were old enough got after-school jobs. And those who weren't old enough to go to school did housework and took care of the new mouse. Let's see what happens here. Edgar, remember he was the oldest, modeling himself after his father, got 2 jobs delivering newspapers and sweeping up in a grocery store. Here's Edgar delivering newspapers, and here he is sweeping up in a grocery store. So Edgar got 2 jobs. And with 17 mice cleaning the house, it was spotless. With 14 mice working, the money was soon rolling in. Edgar kept it in cookie jars. He spent what was needed for necessities, and he saved what was left for a rainy day. Soon, Mr. and Mrs. Mouse were rested and eager to get back to work. "I'd go nuts just sitting around the house," said Mr. Mouse. So Mr. Mouse became a fireman, and Mrs. Mouse became a tennis instructor. Here's Mr. Mouse on his fire truck. And let's see, Mrs. Mouse is right here as a tennis instructor. She used to be a roller skating instructor, didn't she? Now she's a tennis instructor. Mr. and Mrs. Mouse also began scrubbing, cleaning, and cooking again. But sometimes they just sat down and enjoyed their children. All the Mouse children continued their after-school jobs because they enjoyed working, and the extra money helped. Before long, Baby Mouse was helping too. Baby Mouse was the cashier, kept track of all the money that was coming in. And that is the story of Another Mouse to Feed. And they're the 3 books that we had to read this morning. And I really enjoyed reading them, and I hope you enjoyed hearing them. And I thank you for coming to Story Time today, and we'll see you again. Thank you.